Hello, welcome YouTube subscribers, maybe at least hitting the like button. I don't know. That's what happens when I watch YouTube. They keep reminding you to subscribe and like because it's good for the channel. I don't know how, but maybe you do that, maybe you don't. But welcome to the Ministry in a Secular Age podcast. I'm Andrew Root with Derek Tronsgard here. And this is, like I said, the YouTube version, which gives you a little bit more of an extended take on our podcast before Derek gets his producing fingers on things and shines it up and gives you that well polished podcast that you can get through your audio feeds, whether Spotify or iTunes, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. So that's us. This is the YouTube version. Thanks for finding us. And Derek, what should we talk about today?
All right. I want to launch in to an email question. So shout out to Linnea and also to Trudy for sending in basically the same question. So we appreciate that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for reading Andy's books. We thought this would be a great thing to launch into today. So I'm just going to read this email that was sent to you, and I would like you to just launch into it. Here we go.
See if we can respond. Yeah.
Dr. Root, I am a PhD student earning a degree in practical theology. My dissertation topic is Christopraxis and discipleship in the church. I have read your book and was hoping for some clarification. You speak of God's being as becoming, and I am having difficulty understanding what you mean by that. I would greatly appreciate any insight you could provide, as I will be using your book in my literature review. Thank you for your time and consideration. God bless. So, Andy, what do you got?
What is God's being as becoming? Well, I mean, the first thing to say is it's not my mouthful of phrase, but I am guilty for using it. It comes from Eberhard Jungel, the great late 20th century. He made it into the early 21st century German thinker. So it is my fault that I have addictions to German thinkers and their mouthful of words. But I think it's an important phrase, and really the kind of background of it. It is a mouthful. It feels a little like esoteric, which I kind of like. It feels a little like, slippery, which maybe is not great for readers, but I find interesting concepts. I like this about German thinking a bit as you kind of make up words or concepts. But the idea really here of God's being as becoming is well, it kind of goes in many ways. I don't know if Jung would agree with this, but kind of goes back to the tradition of Soren Kierkegaard, where Kierkegaard said, the person of Jesus Christ is the rock that all metaphysics crashes on. And the basic point of this is that there's a huge turn that Kierkegaard, for the most part, initiates, but it's actually Luther in many ways who initiates this, which is a kind of movement against Greek thought. And I don't know, did we talk in this podcast a little bit about Plato's cave and that stuff? Did we do that? Maybe
I
I
don't
did that.
I don't think we have. If we did, and I'm forgetting, super fans of the podcast that are screaming right now chime in, but I'm pretty sure we haven't. So
Yeah, well, one of the most interesting things I think that builds up to this concept of God's being as becoming is the big impact of Heidegger's work and Heidegger kind of pushing back against um, kind of Greek metaphysical thought, and particularly Plato's thought that everything that's real that's happening, or the perfect form, is happening outside the cave. So you get the analogy of the cave. Did we talk about the analogy of the cave, Derek? I don't think we
no,
did.
I remember it from my freshman philosophy course way back when. So you're
Okay.
like dusting
Yeah.
off some old cupboards for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is also, those on YouTube are seeing that Derek listens to the podcast 7 times before it goes out. I listen to it exactly 0 times before it goes out. So I can't remember what I've said, but you catalog all that in your brain. So the basic point is your brain goes blank. Um, the
Can you
basic
repeat the
point
part about the
is
stuff where you said all about the things?
about the
Yeah. Okay.
things. Yeah. Yeah, there is a little bit of a Homer Simpson overtone to this, but basically Heidegger's point was that kind of Greek metaphysics, and particularly going back to Aristotle, had this assertion, well, the parable of the cave, that we were essentially prisoners caged to a cave, and then we were down in that cave so long to kind of nuance his parable a bit. We've been down in that cave so long that we've come to confuse the reflections on the cave wall of the bonfire that's down in that cave wall, that those shadows we've come to think are reality. But really what's real is outside. So there's a kind of metaphysical, there's a reality outside the cave that's really real. So you get this kind of sense of Plato's forms, like the true form is outside the cave. Well, Luther thought that before Luther became Bible professor at Wittenberg, he taught on the Greek philosophers. And so he knew these Greek philosophers well, and he actually found a problem with them. And the big problem he found with them is that he felt like there was no correlation between these kind of Greek metaphysical thought and the experience that he was having of feeling abandoned by God, nor did it make any sense to the psalmists. So when you read the psalmists, they seemed to correlate with his experience, like that he felt God forsaken. He felt like God had abandoned him. He felt a deep sense of pain and joy and nearness to God and then distance from God. I mean, he felt all those realities, and he saw that echoed in the Psalms, but he definitely did not see that echoed in Aristotle and in Plato. So he has one of my favorite Luther lines that probably people who've listened to this podcast have heard me say before, is that Luther says, and it's actually Jungel who quotes this, so there's a connection here, where he says, Jungel quotes Luther as saying, all the Greek philosophers are a problem, but Aristotle is a particularly devilish fellow, because Aristotle does have this sense that you could perfect yourself. So in the cave, I mean, in some ways, Aristotle's trying to get us out of the cave. It's not just about these metaphysical forms, but it's how we act within the polos. But the metaphysic remains, and Plato's metaphysic remains. But this is Kierkegaard's point. Kierkegaard's point is Jesus Christ is the rock that all metaphysics crash upon, because what becomes essential in the Christian confession is that God is known in the world, that God breaks into the world, that God is fully made present in the person of Jesus Christ, who lives and breathes and moves. So Heidegger, who isn't that interested in Christology like Kierkegaard is on who Jesus Christ is, he felt like Luther was the first move against this metaphysical thinking. And the problem with the metaphysical thinking, this was going to all tie together, I promise, is that the problem with this metaphysical thinking is we keep on escaping or moving our minds beyond what it means to live right now, what it means to live concretely right now. And the issue for us, Heidegger thinks, is it isn't that we don't have the forms right, or we have no access to the forms, or we have to kind of think right about the metaphysical realities. The reality is that we exist, that we are being right here, that we have concrete lives to live, that we have to make sense of our existence in this way. So he really drives us towards the concrete and lived. And Bonhoeffer really picked this up. So if you read Bonhoeffer, you hear all this stuff about the concreteness, and he particularly wants to get at the concreteness of revelation, how God reveals God's self concretely and really in human history. So this whole idea of God's being as becoming, what it essentially is it's in this tradition of this kind of Christologically centered kind of dynamic, or this incarnational reality of God breaking forth. And it's making this assertion that the only God we can know is the God who acts, that there's no kind of acrobatics in a kind of metaphysical way, in a kind of philosophical way, that a pastor can do. All a pastor can do is proclaim the God who has made God's self known. So this is Jungel's mouthful assertion, is God's being is in becoming. And what he really means is God's being is in God's act. The God we know is a God who acts, and this God acts for us. This God makes God's self known. And where that becomes really important, and why I use that in a discussion about practical theology, is because there's an assertion, and this is like putting together Jungel and Bonhoeffer here. There's this assertion that the God we should know, the God that acts, the God whose being is in becoming, has practical impact on our being, that God addresses us, that God comes to us, so that the ways we live become the ways we encounter God. And see, this, to me, this is the real ultimate challenge of the pastor, is the pastor has to find a way to practice the sense that God's being is in becoming, that God is acting, that God is moving within the congregation, that God is speaking to people, that God is directing people's lives, or else all you become about is trying to get people to think the right thoughts, that essentially have the right ideas about God. And this was kind of Heidegger's point that Bonhoeffer has particularly picked up, is that when we follow the metaphysical obsessions, we become we fetishize ideas. It becomes all about the idea, which is why in Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer always is contrasting cheap grace as the idea of grace, and costly grace is the very person of Jesus Christ, which you can see there's a difference between, oh, I think about justification as faith alone in a way that is it's caught in the metaphysical sense that God fulfills the ought for me. So all I have to do is accept the idea. I accept the idea of justification by faith alone. And Bonhoeffer's point is that becomes cheap because it gives me no sense that I'm directed out into the world to concretely encounter Christ with my neighbor, to be with my neighbor, and to have to encounter Christ in the concrete realities of life. And so this is what we mean by God's being as becoming, is that God breaks forth, God comes near, that God makes God's being know who God is. If we just think of being as who is God, you can only know God through God's action, through how God makes God's self known to us. And then it becomes a big question for us kind of pastorally, is how does our being participate then in the being of God? How do we come to know God? And participate in God's being. And my assertion is, and my theologically, what I'm trying to get at here, is that we share in God's being by joining God's act. So God is the one who acts for us. So God's being as becoming, the way I would want to kind of paraphrase that, and maybe this is just as much of a mouthful, is God is fundamentally one who ministers to the world, that God ministers to others, that we know God through God's acts of, well, like as Robert Jensen said, God is the one who, whoever God is, I mean, you can hear Jensen being this kind of anti-metaphysics kind of thinking. God is the one who frees Israel from Egypt and raises Jesus from the dead. Again, the only God you can know is the God who acts. God's being is in becoming. God's being is in bringing forth new life in Jesus Christ. That God's being is in what God does, in how God acts. And so the church becomes the community that testifies to this reality. All right, Derek, I can see your face, and that's a mouthful.
I'm going to try to summarize this as far as I understood it. So what you're saying, no, I think this really matters for pastoral ministry, and we're going to land this plane here today. What I think you're saying, or what I hear you say, is the Greek philosophical tradition would say that there is that Platonic ideal where it's perfect, but it's also beyond our capacity to experience or understand because we are limited in our human capacities. So again, we're in the cave. There's an outside of the cave where everything is exactly the way it should be. It's perfect. It's ideal. It is pure. It's all of that stuff. The God of Jesus Christ breaks that apart because that God incarnates into flesh and shows up in a particular way as Jesus of Nazareth, who goes out and is in specific places, in specific moments, with specific people, and does things to them that goes beyond the ideal. And what's interesting to me is then you get these Bible stories where, you know, Mary and Martha tell Jesus that Lazarus is sick and he doesn't get there in time. And then they'll say like, oh, if he would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And that's smashing against that idealized version of God because it doesn't meet their expectations. But then yet this is the God who acts and does stuff on their behalf for them. And that's what makes all the difference. Because if we're just worshiping this ideal God that's outside of the cave, that God doesn't give a shit about us. But this God does. And that is what ministry and faith in life is all about. How did I do?
You did pretty good. So there's two things to nuance on that. I mean, One is there is a way within that tradition for us to conceptualize that. So there's certain ways of thinking, I mean, this is like the foundation of philosophy, like certain ways of philosophically thinking to get yourself into, or to get yourself kind of, I guess, in touch, or to know the forms, so that it is outside, but there's a kind of right way of thinking. So you can think in the medieval reality, like scholasticism becomes a way of doing theology that is a kind of way of grasping the metaphysical reality. So there's a certain kind of rationalism, or a kind of way of thinking that can get you there. The second thing is, you said, like the God of Jesus Christ, which at its fullest is, that's exactly right. But this is a very Hebrew way of thinking about God. This is the way Yahweh, the God of Israel, works. So sometimes you'll hear this phrase like, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? Like, these are two completely different kind of logics, and really what the patristic fathers do, and the third through the sixth century, is try to bring these things together in some kind of coherent logic, have them kind of cross fertilize and feed each other. Some people have a real problem with that. Some people think it's an incredible revolution that happens, but this is particularly the Greek patristic fathers, like, this is what they do. This is in some sense how we get Trinitarian thinking and things like that, and we get our creeds. Is it's the bringing together this kind of Neoplatonism with the Hebrew Bible, with the letters of Paul, with the gospel stories. So, but this becomes a major different kind of framework for Israel, because God becomes the one who reveals God's self. God becomes the one who speaks to Abraham, the one who comes and shows up in the bush that doesn't, the bush that burns but isn't consumed, to Moses. God is the one who arrives, and this is another piece that another writer. One of the reasons we're doing this podcast is because I get these two emails. One saying, "What is God's being as becoming?" And I'm afraid we haven't been as clear as maybe this reader wants us to be. And another one was like, "Hey, I read The Pastor to Secular Age. I don't get this piece about that God is the one who arrives. That this is the arriving God." But this is the sense that Israel has of their God, that this God shows up, this God arrives, this God comes into this moment and speaks. This God wasn't here, but now is here, and is speaking in this sense. And this is another way that I've used in my writing, and built off other theologians, that says God's being is in God's act. It's another way of saying, like, God's being is in becoming. That God's being is an event. It's an encounter. It's a happening. It's something that occurs. It's not an idea. It's a reality that happens in the world. So it should when God acts, the divine act should have the reality of impacting our lives, of forming our communities. And I think this is the real challenge that the pastor has to deal with, is in late modernity, there is this kind of sense that you could just turn God into an idea that you ask people to commit to, as in some sense, like a brand, like any other brand. Like, I believe in the Protestant God. I believe in democracy. I believe that the 1991 Twins were the greatest Twins team that ever played. I believe in this parenting method. Like, these become all kind of things that you believe, that you kind of have a conscious consent to. But really, I think this perspective is saying something deeper, which is that there is an interruption, there's an event, there's an unveiling of God before us, and that happens in our lives, that this occurs. So, like, for Karl Barth, who was really trying to work this perspective, and Jungel's assertion, his phrase, God's being is in becoming, is a shorthand for Karl Barth's theology. I mean, this phrase comes out in what he's trying to explain Karl Barth is trying to do. That Karl Barth is trying to say God's being is in becoming. So even for a modern person, it doesn't feel like, in the modern world, God's being is before us at every turn, which it maybe did as a medieval person. It just felt like, and we've talked about this in Charles Taylor's description, that the reality of God just seemed to hang on every piece of the cultural accoutrements, nature. It just, if you were a medieval person, it just felt like the divine in God hung on every piece of it, whether it was cultural, whether it was the way you dressed and talked, whether it was why the seasons changed. It all seemed to just it just dripped of a divine reality. But on the far side of modernity, it feels quite absent of that. It feels like everything we encounter is a desert to the divine, that it's completely absent of that. And so it becomes really hard to just make a presumption that this metaphysical reality kind of slides into the natural world. So one thing you do is you just give up on the whole project, just give up on it and say, well, what being a pastor is preparing people for kind of cultural engagement, however you might define that. Like you might define that, the kind of yin and yang within that. And this gets us controversial here, but one is like you just think you equate the American project with Christianity, and you just celebrate American, you celebrate Christianity, or you go to the other extreme, and this again is yin and yang. Will make some people uncomfortable with us. You just think of different political identity affirmations that are necessary, and you just link the church up with those kind of realities, and that's what it is. And you're just trying to raise people's consciousness to certain kind of the necessities of political recognition and things like that, and that's the kind of best you can do. And maybe at a personal level you say, well, religion is good for children because it gives them, I don't know, self-esteem, or it's good for teenagers because it gives them some kind of moral compass, maybe, or maybe there's a better moral compass somewhere else. And you can kind of double down on all those things, or you can make this radical assertion that Karl Barth does, and then those who follow him, and that Bonhoeffer really agrees with, and that Eberhard Jungel is giving us this really crazy phrase about, that still, even in this late modern world, God acts, God moves, God speaks, that God breaks forth and makes God's self known in our concrete lives, transforming our lives, changing our lives. Where does that happen? Like for Karl Barth, this is how practical it gets. It's in the preached word. That when we preach the word, God can show up. You have no kind of magical incantation that makes sure God can show up. God is God, after all. But God does reveal God's self in this particular practical moment of the one called and elect to proclaim the word, standing up in the pulpit and preaching the word. God acts. The event of the sermon is when God's being is as becoming, that God moves in that way. One of the big pieces that I've tried to assert here, throughout my work, is that yes, it is in that. I come out of that kind of tradition. I think that is a really captivating way of thinking about what it means to proclaim Christ and him crucified in late modernity. But I also think there's something about human persons who bear each other's burdens, where in the midst of having my death experiences shared by another, God's being as becoming. God becomes present in those moments, bringing life out of death in those moments, and that people can testify to the transformation, the nearness of Christ. I mean, there's kind of an echo of the road to Emmaus there. Someone bears our burdens with us, gives us consolation up against our experiences of death. We find God where God chooses to be found, on the cross. And so the cross itself is the rupturing of all metaphysics, in the sense that God is found here in this event. God's being is in becoming in the dead Nazarene on the cross. That's where God is found, in history, in time, in a place, transforming the world. But you also hear this God's being is in becoming. It's like it's continuing to happen because it's also eschatological. It also is bringing forth a new creation, a new reality. It's from this event is having tentacles and movements out beyond it to redeem it. So it's also making this assertion of a new future that's being broken forth, a new history that's coming forth from this reality. So God's being as becoming says God's being is an act, but it also is bringing forth a new being in Christ, a new being and participating in Christ's reality. So there's a kind of, mystical isn't quite the right word, but there's a deep sense of participation in the being of God this way. That God, through God's act, gives us God's being to participate in. But how do we participate in that? Well, we participate in it by proclaiming the word, hearing the word, or consolation, giving consolation, receiving consolation. I mean, it forces us ultimately to have to think concretely about where is God and where is God making God's self known, concretely and really. And it is, I mean, this is a really important piece. It is a kind of rebuke, a kind of breaking of closing God into religion. So God isn't just found in like religious structures that can cage God. God's being is becoming. It shatters those. It breaks those. That we get those kind of prophetic statements that I'm not interested in all of your prayers. I'm not interested in all your liturgies, if you will. What I'm interested in is your encounter in being faithful to your neighbor, showing I love mercy and kindness, and your attention to the poor, to see my being and becoming, to see the way that I'm breaking forth and giving ministry and bringing forth this reality of God's ultimate shalom, or God's ultimate bring forth of God's kingdom, that becomes the reality that's being pulled forth. So the preacher has to both point to the concrete now. Jesus Christ is breaking forth, and Jesus Christ is promising to bring forth a full new world, and that's the kind of demand that's set forth. So it's like, in this event right now, Jesus Christ calls you to follow, and he calls you to follow into this future that's coming forth and is promised to you.
It strikes me as interesting, this conversation with that story of the burning bush and Moses, when God reveals God's name to Moses, and it's, Yahweh I am, which is a verb. I feel like we have this tendency to want to nounify God, like turn God into a noun, like it's a thing or something we talk about. And that's really what a Platonic ideal is. It's a noun. What you're saying is God's a verb, like God's very being is a verb because it's active, but also that's baked into the divine name too, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we could get a little bit, weirdly, I don't know, like we'd have to get stoned a little bit. Like, dude, God is just like a verb, man. But ultimately, you're right. Like, in the sense that what we could lose is that God is anything. Like, God is a concrete center that speaks, or a kind of. I mean, it's hard because you don't want to say like you don't want to equate and say that God is just us in a loud voice, or God is a psychological consciousness, like we are a psychological consciousness. There's a qualitative distinction between God and us, but there is a sense that God addresses us as a dependable person, if we don't think of person as one-on-one equated with us. But ultimately, I mean, there's something really truthful with other relationships here too, that really you only know your spouse or your partner by their act. You know what I mean? Like, it's in the midst of act that we know anyone. Now, don't get me wrong, the act reveals the being, but there is a sense where the act and being are are constituted in this reality. Like, you know what I mean? Like, in some sense, like, your marriage is being as becoming in some sense. It's like it's going, as you continue to act with and for each other is where you see this. Or maybe another, like, I don't know,
Well, I
more
was just thinking
grounded.
of like, have you
Yeah.
ever had an experience where you've met a famous person or someone that you really idolize or you really think is cool,
Yeah.
and you sort of have this conception of what they must be like before you meet them, and then there's that phrase like, "Don't meet your heroes," because then you get around them and you find out they're just like a normal person that does normal stuff. But it's, again, those actions break apart that idealistic image that you had in your head of what that famous person was going to be like, and oftentimes when you meet that person, it's completely different than
Yeah.
what you thought, based
Yeah,
on their
because
actions.
exactly what you're saying. You've had an idea that you've held to of who this person is, but now you have to reckon with the fact that they act towards you. And, granted, they're a finite human being, so maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they don't really want, they can tell you're going to be weird. You know what I mean? Like, they're being self-protective in the midst of this, but now you've had a different encounter. Now you've had an event. See, that's what I'm getting at here. Is like, it's one thing to have, I have an idea about, I don't know, like Joe Mauer or something. We're going twins here. Like, I have an idea about this person, but then when I encounter him, then all of a sudden, the interactions, being and becoming, all of a sudden arrives, and I have to know him through his act. And so maybe even has a bad day, but that bad day gives me a certain sense of how I experience him. Complete, we should get away from Joe Mauer. I think he's probably a lovely guy. But, all of a sudden you have a bad experience with a celebrity or a well-known person that you've had an idea of, and you're like, this person's a complete jerk. Now, maybe that was just their bad day, but this is the reality that it's within the event. You've had an event, and the event helps you determine how you encounter their being next to your being. That their being comes to you in becoming, in acting towards you. So it's within the event that you know them. And I guess this is what I'm getting at is like the God who comes to us as an event is not saying that God doesn't really exist. It's just in your head. It's just in it is not saying like kind of like like Durkheim, like just saying like, well, like, God is just cultural effervescence. Like when you feel that glow at a sporting event, or you feel at a concert like that, we could use Rose's word, a resonance, that's God. No, that's not necessarily what this means. What this means is that in all encounters with persons, you know them in and through the event encountering them. Like people will tell these stories. You can read a memoir like this. Like they had an idea of who their dad was that they had never met, that they'd been disconnected from their biological father. And then they met their father and it became an even more painful experience, or it became a reconciling experience because the event of actual encounter, of being spoken to, of being addressed, that becomes the transformational dynamic. So again, this is the challenge of the pastor. Is your objective to commit people to religion, and therefore it's accoutrements of ideas? Or is it about walking the very narrow path of helping them encounter a living God through event? And that, to me, that's where transformation occurs. It's in that reality that God transforms a life, that God moves in this very practical way and changes our Dasein, our being here, our existence. And this is what Bonhoeffer means by when Jesus Christ calls you to come and follow, and to follow very practically towards death, towards the cross, towards the practicality of where God's being is revealed in the event that occurs. So if you want to know who this God is, you have to look of the event of God's act that is given to us in the biblical story, and particularly as Protestants, we would say primarily in the cross of Jesus Christ in a kind of Pauline sense.
So, what do you see as the big pitfalls right now that churches fall into, or the temptations where we don't want to proclaim God as an event and we want to slip back into those idealistic forms?
Well, I mean, the biggest pitfall, especially as late modern people, is it's not quite that it feels illogical. It just feels nebulous. And it feels like you can just get caught in maybe your own subjectivity, or there's a certain kind of sense in a deep way that is not an individual's burden to bear, but is the whole kind of cultural context burden to bear, is that it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable that God would act for people. So instead, we should just think of the pastor as running a congregation and trying to make a congregation wear the marks of success, or it is trying to raise people's consciousness so they take better political positions that we actually think are more morally correct. And this isn't to like say that there isn't ethics involved in this either. Like there's a deep kind of ethic that plays within this reality as well. But we can kind of really get caught in ethics that isn't bound in the eventfulness of God's revealing God's self. So to me, that's the challenge, because, well, I mean, this is a theme that's run throughout this podcast, thanks to Hartmut Rosa, is that claiming God's being is and becoming is uncontrollable, completely uncontrollable. To claim that God is an event, and that God will show up in your preaching or in people's lives in the world, as they seek to follow Jesus Christ into the sorrow of others. You can't say that's going to happen in 2 weeks, or that's going to happen in 24 hours, or that's going to happen in 4 years. It's simply, you have to, well, here's a theme that I've had that, yeah, that you've had to wait for. This is why waiting for me becomes a really practical way we live for this, is because what we're waiting for isn't like enlightenment, or it isn't creativity, or it isn't a way to just pause and rest as a way to kind of find endurance again. No, waiting is a way of preparing ourselves, of taking a disposition, of taking on a vision and an openness for God's being as becoming, for the eventfulness of God's arrival, for God to come and arrive. Um, and I think that's the biggest challenge, is how pastors prepare a whole community of people to say God's going to show up, God is moving, and help them have a kind of theological lens to discern what that looks like. How do we know it's God when God shows up? And that does take what we call catechesis. It takes a sense of discernment, but it starts with, is God an idea, or is God the event who acts and speaks and moves? Is God the one who is a verb, like you're saying, who's moving, or is God a static a static outline of propositions?
And when God shows up and transforms us, we don't have any control of that either. When we've wanted control in curating ourself in this,
Mm-hmm.
Taylor-esque,
Yeah,
authenticity,
yeah.
that's a
I
whole
think
other.
we deeply know that when God comes to transform us, God puts us to death to make us alive. And that feels very scary. That God. I mean, this is part of this tradition, right? Is that God says no, because God's yes is so big. God says no. Um, God is God, so God. This is the dialectic that's at play. Is that God saves us by first of all revealing how lost we are. This is the kind of, we could call this law gospel, or the dialectic of the no and the yes. We could turn that into ideas too, which is, I think sometimes has happened, particularly um, in the Lutheran institution I've worked at and that you were educated from, Derek, that it could easily become a form of its own kind of scholasticism, where it becomes such a rigid kind of idea that you have to do it this way formula. But there's something utterly beautiful about it as a hermeneutic of how God's being is as becoming, how God is an event, that God comes, and in the no comes God's great yes, that God first kills before God makes alive, which is completely politically incorrect. But both Luther and Calvin said that, as did the Hebrew prophets, that God kills and then God makes alive. And this is the work that God does. This is the sense of God's being as becoming.